Okay, we're going to talk about picking again today, and in particular pick slanting, which is a very, very common topic to be talking about on the internet. You've seen a lot of videos on this from Troy Grady and Ben Ella and various other people, and I feel like it's over-egged as a really important thing with your playing, because I don't see a lot of people who can pick slant being able to play lots of really difficult passages. It's more of a part of a whole technique as opposed to an actual thing you need to be practicing. And I'm going to go through why. Pick slanting, generally speaking, is all about either pointing it slightly towards your face or slightly towards the floor. So you get this kind of thing going on depending on which direction you are escaping. So if I am escaping upwards, I escape like this on an upstroke, and if I'm escaping downwards, I escape like this on the downstroke, and I'm escaping the strings on either one of those, which means I can cross strings easier. That's the theory. There's a bit of a problem with that, though, in that you need to bake in the muscle memory of how all these things work in each individual case, not just have a general idea of, oh, the pick needs to point down or the pick needs to point up here. And there's actually 4 different pick slanting motions. You might think there's only 2 because you either point it up or point it down, but this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated, and this is often where I see a lot of people going wrong. So the obvious pick slanting motions are to point the pick in this direction, but the slightly different way of thinking about it is that even if the pick is pointed in this direction, vertically I'm either traveling down or I'm traveling up. So I've got 2 different motions I need to learn. Pick pointing up and then hand going down to a string below the one that I'm playing, or pick pointing up and hand going up to a string above the one I'm playing. And that's a really important distinction because these 2 motions feel very different. To give you an example of how this sort of works, and something that's very common, is if we play through a descending pentatonic, let's say A minor, and I do this. Most people find this to be one of the easiest things to do, and the reason is that if I do that pick slant and I point it towards my face, the pick comes up here, and then also the wrist comes up at the same time. So both are acting in the same direction. I'll switch pick there just because that thing is absolutely terrible to play with. So people find that pretty easy to do. So you've got this coming upwards like that. And because both are operating in the same direction, there's no confusion over how that works to change strings. But quite a lot of people find the reverse slightly more difficult. If I try and do this all the way down, what I end up having to do is move the pick this way, angled towards my face, but move the wrist downwards. They're almost in contrary to each other. One's moving down, one's moving up at the same time. Notice how that looks different to this, which is kind of what we do on the way back down the neck. If I do this, that I'm enabling my hand to move further than I am if I do this. That requires me to move the pick up, but the wrist down to get to that A string. So it's up and down at the same time as opposed to both of them going upwards. This is a lot harder because, again, it requires a different motion. It requires a different set of things that you're learning via muscle memory to get that to work. Now, it gets even worse when we look at the other direction. Most people find the other direction harder anyway. But if I was to start, let's say, on an upstroke here and do this, which you never really do. But what's happening there is that when I start on an upstroke, the downwards motion of the pick coming out of the guitar this way also assists me coming down with the wrist. So, and gravity is acting in the same direction as well. So we get all 3 of these things working to push that pick towards the floor and the wrist towards the floor at the same time. So this is easier for a lot of people than if I do it the other way and I do something like this. And again, that pick really lets me down demonstrations. Most people find that way harder. This is why you never buy a 5mm pick, by the way. Hopefully you can see the difference there. But the point being is that when I'm pointing at the floor here, what I have to learn is to be able to pick downwards like this and then move the wrist upwards at the same time. Now, there's a really important distinction to make here. You don't want these motions to be one after the other because that's going to mess with your picking hand a lot. So you don't want to do this. You don't want to pick downwards and then move the wrist up. Or you don't want to pick upwards and then move the wrist down, or pick upwards and then move the wrist up. Everything has to go at once in the same it's like sort of same motion, so you kind of imagine you're doing the same muscle movement to do both. That's a really good way of thinking about some of these string changes, as opposed to trying to do one motion, move it, and then do the next motion. Always going to be slower than the alternative. So where this comes really useful is if we look at our 3-note per string scales. This is often, again, something that people really struggle with. One of the hardest things to play on guitar is just going down a scale. So if I do this, if I go... And what's going to happen here, if I'm trying to play up that scale, is I need to be able to do... This motion's okay, because the downstroke goes in the same direction as the next string I'm trying to take. So I'm going downwards pick escape, and then also moving down. So this is very easy for me to then move that hand down naturally. But we then get to here, and we do an upwards pick escape, but the upwards pick escape has to move down still, like that. Hopefully you can see what's happening there. It's that upwards motion on the way down that's really difficult to get right, because you're having to pick upwards but move the wrist downwards, and that's something that's counterintuitive for a lot of people. It's even worse on the way back. If I do this, this is the one that most people find really hard, and the reason being is that when I do this, down, up, down, I'm now having to shift to picking down and pointing at the floor, but at the same time bringing that wrist back. So I'll try and exaggerate it like that. And that's the bit that really trips people up on the way back. And it's because you can't just think of it as a pick slant. If you just think of it like a pick slant, you don't get that vertical motion in there. And the vertical motion is the part of this that is the hardest bit to get right. So at speed, you'll just trip over yourself all the time. So hopefully you can kind of see what's going on here now, is that we have these 4 different ways of approaching things. You've got upwards pick slanting and then wrist motion this way or wrist motion that way. And you've got downwards pick slanting with the same thing, wrist motion this way or wrist motion that way. And that's really important, because if you can get all of those ideas mastered, then no matter what you get thrown in terms of alternate picking, you'll probably be quite good at doing it. So some things to practice here are just trying to find some of these patterns that use those ways of moving your hand. So if I do something like, I don't know, a pattern of 5s, this is quite a good one. I can guarantee what normally happens with people when they try and do this is this motion at the end, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, downstroke, and then moving back up is what catches them out. That's going to throw a lot of people off. And equally, here you might find up, down, up, and then moving the wrist down. Because if you try and get these wrist motions baked in, what ends up happening is it sort of just feels like your picking hand doesn't change what it's doing on any particular string, and then the wrist is navigating all of the motions of pick slanting for you. But if you try and do those two things separately, if you try and do the wrist motion in the middle of a pick stroke, for example, you throw off what the wrist, what the natural pick motion is, and what ends up happening is you get something like this, where we go move and then pick, and it looks really weird. It almost has a hopping motion to it, which is really problematic for a lot of people. And we've already, talked a lot about how hopping around strings is the slowest way to work. That's caused by trying to move downwards and then pick and trying to turn it into separate motions. That's often the problem, and that's why people end up hopping in the first place. So if it's all one motion, if you do this and you go down, up, down, and then also move down, and here, down and move up. So there's 2 downwards pick escapes there, and it would be down and move down, down and move up. And in the other one, it's going to be, this is why I like the patterns of 5, it's because we cover pretty much every pick stroke here. The other one's going to be up, down, up, move down, and then down, up, move up. So you get that kind of thing going on, and you can hopefully see it's covering all of our bases here in a really nice way. So you can practice all of these different motions with odd numbered patterns very, very quickly, which is why I keep talking about odd numbered groupings and being a real litmus test of how good your alternate picking is. So hopefully this has been useful, because this is the detail that's lacking on the internet, at least to my eyes, of how to navigate your pick slanting endeavors in a lot of different ways. And just try and pay attention to this. So if you are trying to learn a really difficult alternate picking line, try not just to work out which motion you should be doing, should it be pointing up or pointing down, but also try and work out which direction am I going. Now, the final point on this is that gravity both assists you and kicks your ass on this. So generally speaking, all the motions that come back up the neck, what ends up happening for the vast majority of people is they never come back far enough. So they only do like a tiny little upwards motion, and they don't quite get back to a point where it's comfortable for the wrist to keep playing, descending those strings. So gravity gets in your way big time when it comes to like a downwards motion and then moving up the neck in particular, because you have to actually pull that hand further up the neck than you might think. And the same thing goes with pulling upward pick escape and then upwards motion. It's better to make these things bigger to start with than it is to try and keep them super small, because you are fighting gravity on the way back up, and that is going to cause a problem. Hopefully that's been useful. Let me know in the comments what you think of that, and happy practicing.